Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Okay, good morning everyone. Okay, so we've been studying in the book the chapter called Deepening One's Perspective on the World. And as I explained last week, this chapter I call this a transitional chapter, the chapter which is placed in between the section of the teaching on teachings that lead to one's welfare and happiness in the future life, or teachings that lead to a fortunate rebirth, and then the third level of the Dhamma, third level of the teaching, which are teachings which lead to the ultimate goal, or to the highest good. And this transitional chapter is placed here because there's something of a radical break between the teachings of the first two levels, teachings concerned with well-being and happiness here and now, and the teachings concerned with a fortunate rebirth, so with happiness in a future life. Because here we have to see why the Buddha directs his teaching to liberation from all forms of conditioned existence, from all forms of re-becoming or rebirth. And the Buddha does so by pointing out the various disadvantages, dangers, or shortcomings in worldly life and conditioned existence. Last time we explored this in terms of this threefold pattern that the Buddha uses for organizing many of his teachings. The threefold pattern begins with the teaching on what's called asada, which means enjoyment, gratification. Literally, it's the sweet taste, and that consists in pleasure and joy which comes from different domains of experience. For example, sensual pleasures, the pleasure and joy that arise from engaging in sensual pleasures. This is the asada, the enjoyment of sensual pleasures. But then the second step of understanding, the second step in this process, is understanding the adinava, which means the drawback, the danger, the shortcomings in any of these mundane pleasures. And this consists most basically in the fact that whatever object of enjoyment there might be, that object of enjoyment is impermanent. The attachment to it is bound up at some level with suffering. And then these enjoyments are subject to change. In a way, that's saying the same thing as their impermanence. Okay, then the third step, or third level of understanding, is the level of what's called nisarana, which means the outlet, the release, liberation from the objects of attachment. And that is the putting away of desire and attachment, craving and attachment. Okay, so last time we examined one sutta which applies this threefold pattern to three different bases of attachment. One is sensual pleasures, the other is form, physical form, bodily form, and the third is feeling. Okay, now we will continue with the study of some of these excerpts from the suttas. On page 199 we have section number 4 called The Pitfalls in Sensual Pleasures. This consists of a series of similes, which I don't really have to explain them. I think if you read them on your own, they'll be self-explanatory. Sometimes I have to say that the similes even strike me as a bit extreme, somewhat strong. But I want to come to the passage that begins on page 202, which is titled The Fever of Sensual Pleasures. And here the Buddha is in a discussion with a wanderer named Magandiya. In the there's a little background story to this discussion that comes in the Sutta number 75 of the Majjhima Nikaya. Here the Buddha has met this wanderer named Magandiya, and Magandiya had been very critical of the Buddha. The reason being that Magandiya subscribed basically to a philosophy of hedonism. This is the idea that since we have sense organs, and the sense organs are naturally attracted to their respective objects, so the true good of human life can be fulfilled by indulging our desires for sensual pleasures, by abandoning any attempt to restrict or restrain the mind, and just let oneself indulge freely in the pleasures of the senses. That seems to... Magandiya held that the natural order is for the senses to go to their respective objects, their respective sense objects. So the ideal way of life is one in which we allow the senses to enjoy their respective objects. And so Magandiya knew that the Buddha taught the restraint of the senses, and therefore he held that the Buddha was, we call in modern terminology, a killjoy. And so now the Buddha is explaining to Magandiya why he advocates a training, a discipline based upon the restraint of the senses. And here he explains that formerly, when he was living the household life, this is when he was a prince in Kapilavastu, he was able to enjoy himself provided with the 5 chords of sensual pleasures. The 5 chords of sensual pleasures are the 5 enjoyable sense objects. Then he gives a little background, sort of biographical information. He says that he had 3 palaces, one for each of the seasons. In northern India, there are 3 seasons in the year. The rainy season, which lasts from roughly July till October. The cold season, which lasts from about November till March. Then the hot season, which is from March till late June. So for each of these seasons, he had a separate palace, which was especially constructed to be most comfortable during that season. And during the rainy season, he would live in the palace that built especially for the rains for 4 months, enjoying himself with his musicians and dancers who were all female, and he never even left the palace. Okay, then he says, on a later occasion, having understood as they really are the origin, the passing away, then we have this threefold pattern here. The gratification, the danger, and the escape in the case of sensual pleasures. So now he came to see beneath this enjoyment that he had it constantly at his disposal, he came to see the danger in the sensual pleasures. And then he also discovered the escape from sensual pleasures, which is the abandoning of craving and attachment to sensual pleasures. So then he says, I abandoned the craving for sensual pleasures. I removed the fever of sensual pleasures, maybe here the fever of sensual desires, and I dwell without thirst, with the mind inwardly at peace. Now, by abandoning sensual craving, far from feeling miserable, unhappy, deprived, he finds himself inwardly at peace, experiencing this constant inward peace. And so then when he sees other people who are not free from craving for sensual pleasures, who are devoured by craving for sensual pleasures, burning with the fever of sensual pleasures. Again, it's rather strong language. He says, I do not envy them, nor do I delight therein. He does not have any desire for these sensual pleasures. Okay, then he says, what is the reason for that? He says, because there is a delight apart from sensual pleasures, apart from unwholesome states, which surpasses even divine bliss. And since I take delight in that, I do not envy what is inferior, nor do I delight therein. Now, there's an important point here, and that is that the aim of the Buddha's practice is not to reach a state which is completely devoid of pleasure and enjoyment, but rather Buddhism grades different types of pleasure and enjoyment in terms of their value. And those types of pleasure and enjoyment which are deeper, more stable, more invulnerable to external influences, are considered superior to those types of pleasure and enjoyment which are dependent upon external sources, which are unstable, transient, and which are relatively shallow. And corresponding to this conception of different levels of pleasure and enjoyment is a conception which is not explicitly stated in the sutta of different levels of mind. And so we have a level of mind which is connected with the sensual world. Okay, and so the pleasure which one obtains through the enjoyment of sensual pleasures is a pleasure which stimulates and involves that level of the mind. The level of the mind which is, we say, the counterpart of the sensual world. But beyond the sensual mind, or the mind that belongs to the sense domain, there is another domain of mind, a mind which is sort of naturally oriented towards the states of samadhi, of meditative absorption. And the mind which enters into these states of samadhi, meditative absorption, can experience a pleasure, a happiness and enjoyment which is deeper than the enjoyment that comes from sensual pleasures. It's a level of happiness which is more stable. A level of happiness which, because it's inward, is not dependent upon outward sources of support, of gratification. Okay, even deeper than the level of the mind that's oriented towards the states of samadhi, there's a level of the mind which is oriented towards the world transcending, towards nibbana. And the happiness which comes from that level of mind, when that level of mind is realized, is much deeper, much more stable, even than the happiness that comes through the attainment of samadhi, of ordinary samadhi. This is the mind which realizes nibbana, which attains this unconditioned state. And that level of mind, when one achieves that level of mind, then one can experience happiness, peace, under all conditions, under all circumstances. So it's much more stable even than the mind which attains deep samadhi. And so when the Buddha says here that there is a delight apart from sensual pleasures, apart from unwholesome states, which surpasses even divine bliss, he's referring to this level of mind through which one experiences, through which one attains the happiness of nibbana, the unconditioned happiness. And so the Buddha is able to enter into that state of mind, and he takes delight in that. And so then when he looks back at the enjoyment of sensual pleasures, he feels no envy for those who are able to enjoy sensual pleasures. And then he illustrates this with a simile. Okay, suppose there is a householder, somebody who is wealthy, and he's able to enjoy all the 5 types of sensual pleasures. Everything is at his command. We might imagine he's living in a nice mansion on a hilltop. Everything is electrically controlled, so whatever he wants, he just has to press a button and his desires are immediately fulfilled. And so he's able to indulge, to enjoy all the 5 types of sensual pleasures. But he also is observing ethical conduct. And so with the breakup of the body after death, he's reborn in a good realm of existence, in a heavenly world. Here the text mentions what's called the Tavatengsa Deva world. This is one of the sensual heavenly worlds. Please excuse us, but you have to remember that the Buddha is speaking against the background of a masculine, patriarchally organized society, and so it's always conceived of the one who goes to heaven is surrounded by a group of nymphs. Okay, so then, after he's reborn in this Deva world, he's able to enjoy what are called the 5 chords of divine sensual pleasure. These are the sensual pleasures of the 5 senses, but at a different level from that of the human sensual pleasures. These are the 5 sensual pleasures that the deities enjoy. Okay, now, it's difficult for human beings to see the devas, to see the deities, but it's said to be not unusual for the deities to be able to look down at the human world and to see human beings engaged in their activities. So, we might suppose that this householder, now he's been reborn as a deity, enjoying himself with the 5 divine sensual pleasures. Now he looks down and he sees a human being who might be wealthy, affluent, enjoying the 5 types of human sensual pleasures. So then the Buddha asks Markandeya, would that young deity, surrounded by his nymphs, enjoying himself with the 5 types of divine sensual pleasures, would he have any envy for the human being enjoying these 5 types of human sensual pleasures? And then Markandeya says, this is not the case. For what reason? Because divine sensual pleasures are more excellent, more sublime than human sensual pleasures. So there's a hierarchy of grades of sensual pleasures here, and the sensual pleasures of the divine realm are superior to those of the human realm. Okay, but now Buddha is using this as an analogy for understanding his own perspective on sensual pleasures. He says, in the same way, formerly I lived a household life, I was able to enjoy the 5 types of sensual pleasures. Then later I abandoned this craving for sensual pleasures, and now I dwell without thirst, with the mind inwardly at peace, and I see other beings, other people who are not free from lust for sensual pleasures, enjoying sensual pleasures, and I do not envy them, nor do I delight therein. And what is the reason? Because there is a delight apart from sensual pleasures, apart from unwholesome states, which surpasses even divine bliss. And since I take delight in that, I do not envy what is inferior, nor do I delight in it. Now here we have to understand, it's important to understand the analogy here. We have to understand that the Buddha is using an analogy here. Okay, on the right side of this little table, we have the relationship between heavenly sensual pleasures and human sensual pleasures. And the heavenly sensual pleasures are considered far superior to the human sensual pleasures. That is the analogy that the Buddha uses. But when he draws the comparison puts all sensual pleasures on the lower side, or in the lower position, and then what can you see from there? What surpasses all sensual pleasures is non-sensual bliss. This will be the bliss that's described here as apart from sensual pleasures, apart from unwholesome states of mind. And this will be the bliss, the pleasure of samadhi, of deep meditation, and the pleasure or bliss of nirvana. Now in the next passage, beginning paragraph 13, the Buddha is going to use another way to show the defect or the shortcoming in sensual pleasures. And again, he does so through a simile, through an analogy. He takes the case of a man with a skin disease. It's translated as a leper, but I don't know exactly the nature of this disease. But he has sores and blisters on his limbs, so that he's constantly plagued by an itching. And then to alleviate the itch, he has to scratch his wounds. He scratches the wounds with his fingernails, or else he heats up his body over a burning charcoal pit. And as he does so, this brings him a certain pleasure. Okay, then one day his relatives bring a physician to treat him. And the physician is able to prepare some medicine that will cure him, so that he no longer has these wounds on his body, he no longer feels this constant itching, and he's no longer compelled to scratch these wounds. He doesn't have the wounds anymore. Okay, then, after being cured, he might see another man with the same skin disease, constantly itching and scratching, heating his body up over a charcoal pit. And as that man is doing so, scratching his itches, heating his body up on the charcoal pit, he's getting a pleasure out of this. But now the man has been cured of his skin disease. And so is he going to envy the man who's scratching his wounds and heating them over the charcoal pit because that man is getting some pleasure out of that activity? And so Markandeya answers, this is not the case, because once he's cured of his illness, he doesn't want to return to that illness just to be able to scratch himself and get some pleasure. Okay, then the Buddha carries this simile a step further. Okay, we have the man who's cured of his illness. In paragraph 15, then two strong men come along and they grab him by both of his arms and they're pulling him towards a burning charcoal pit. And so this would give him an opportunity to heat his body up on the charcoal pit. And if he had that disease, he'd be able to get pleasure out of it. But the man who's now cured of his illness doesn't want to go to the charcoal pit, but he resists the two strong men who are pulling him in that direction. So the Buddha asks him, why is he resisting so forcefully? And Markandeya says, because that fire is painful to the touch, hot and scorching. Then the Buddha asks, is it only now that this fire has been painful, hot and scorching, or was it also painful, hot and scorching in the past? Then Markandeya answers, at present this fire is painful, hot and scorching, and also in the past the fire was painful, hot and scorching. But when that man had the skin disease, then his faculties were impaired. And so even though the fire was painful, hot and scorching, this man acquired a mistaken perception of it as pleasant. And so, because the man had the skin disease, his perception of the nature of fire was distorted. He was not able to experience the fire as it really is, as being painful, scorching, hot. But instead, as he heated his body over that charcoal pit, he perceived it as pleasure. Okay, so now the Buddha explains, or he draws the analogy. In the past, sensual pleasures were painful, hot and scorching. In the future, sensual pleasures will be painful, hot and scorching. And at present, sensual pleasures are painful, hot and scorching. But those people who are not free from lust for sensual pleasures, who are devoured by craving for sensual pleasures, who burn with the fever of sensual pleasures, have faculties that are impaired. And therefore, even though the sensual pleasures are actually, that is from the standpoint of wisdom, though the sensual pleasures are actually painful to touch, these people acquire a mistaken perception of them as pleasant. And here the text that uses a certain very loaded expression in Pali, which would convey the meaning to somebody who knows the implications of these expressions. Okay, the text uses the expression viparita sanya, which means literally it's an upside down perception. And this is connected with a teaching that comes several times in the suttas on the 4 types of distortion of perception. It's called sanya vipalasa. This is the distortions of perceiving what is impermanent as permanent, perceiving what is really dukkha, bound up with suffering or unsatisfactory, perceiving it as being pleasurable, perceiving what is non-self, what is without self, as a self, and perceiving what is really unattractive as being attractive. And so when the text uses this expression, viparita sanya, one could see that there's a reference to these distortions of perception. And here, of the 4 distortions, which one is particularly relevant? Yeah. Say it again. Right. It's perceiving what is really dukkha, unsatisfactory, as being sukha, pleasant. And so the Buddha then draws out the implications. That those people who are not free from craving for sensual pleasures and so on, they have faculties that are impaired. And because the faculties are impaired, even though sensual pleasures are actually painful to touch, that is somebody who has experienced the deep bliss and peace of samadhi will then look back at the pleasures that come from indulging sensual craving and see that these so-called sensual pleasures are really a disturbance of the mind. They're bound up with agitation, worry, excitement, restlessness, whereas this pleasure or bliss of samadhi, of deep meditation, is much more stable, more tranquil, more solid. Okay, so then he'll understand that sensual pleasures are actually painful to touch, but because of this impairment of the faculties, one acquires a mistaken perception of them as pleasant. Okay, and then the Buddha continues, again by drawing out another implication of the simile. Again, we come back to the leper who has the sores and blisters. He's scratching them and getting a certain pleasure from scratching them. So he would find a certain measure of satisfaction and enjoyment in scratching the openings of his wounds. And so the Buddha says, people who are not free from lust for sensual pleasures and so on, the more they indulge in sensual pleasures, the more their craving for sensual pleasure increases, and the more they are burned by the fever of sensual pleasures. Yet they find a certain measure of satisfaction and enjoyment in dependence on the 5 chords of sensual pleasure. Okay, in this passage, the Buddha is explaining why sensual pleasures become so addictive. And the reason why they're so addictive is that indulging them gives this what's called a certain measure of satisfaction and enjoyment. And yet this measure of satisfaction and enjoyment that comes from sensual pleasures is connected with the craving for sensual pleasures in a kind of vicious cycle. That when one indulges the sensual craving, then one gets the satisfaction. The craving is temporarily alleviated. And so for some time one doesn't experience it. But then the craving arises again. And when it arises again, because of the previous satisfaction, it arises more strongly. And so again one has to indulge the craving for sensual pleasures. Again it will give a certain enjoyment. But that enjoyment will just aggravate or intensify the craving for sensual pleasures. And so one has to indulge that desire for sensual pleasures again and again and again. It becomes a vicious cycle, just like the leper who has the skin disease. Whenever he scratches, well, even you, probably nobody here has had leprosy, but you must have had mosquito bites, which are itching, or some other insect bite. It itches, itches, itches. Then you don't want to scratch it, but finally you scratch it. It gives some pleasure, and the itching goes away for, could be 10 seconds, could be a minute, but then it comes on again more strongly. Then when you scratch again, you get some pleasure from it. After a while, there's no itching again for just a short while, but then you have to scratch again, and it will go on and on and on, maybe until the poison from the mosquito bite gets dissipated. Okay, maybe now I'll ask whether there's any questions about this text. Yes, please.
Is samadhi samadhi is still a little bit on the sensual side? It could be, for the samadhi can be sort of on the sensual. Is samadhi can be sort of, is it sort of on the already, or still kind of
okay.
like jhanas?
Yeah, the samadhi or jhana is not a sensual state. It's a state which has to be achieved through detachment from sensual pleasures. But it's still considered a mundane state compared to the happiness of nibbana, nirvana, which is world-transcending happiness. But the text just uses the expression happiness, or uses the expression a delight apart from sensual pleasures, apart from unwholesome states. So this in itself, it's a little bit ambiguous. It could be referring either to the happiness of samadhi or the happiness of nirvana. In fact, the commentary identifies it with nirvanic happiness. But sometimes one doesn't always have to subscribe to the explanation in the commentary. Okay. Any further questions? Boway has a question.
When a person perceives the scorching fire as a physical, this is what describe it as something wrong with the perception. Is there any feeling involved?
Is there any?
Feeling, or it's just wrong perception? My question is whether a feeling is pleasant or not pleasant depends on one's perception only, or once one's perception change and the feeling, the quality of feeling is changed. Does the feeling itself have any nature by itself to be pleasant or not pleasant or neutral?
Okay. The question is whether the feeling itself is pleasant, is definitely pleasant apart from the way it's perceived. And the way I would understand it, I would have to say that the feeling definitely is pleasant. It's not that it's a painful feeling that one is actually mistakenly perceiving as pleasant. So from the level of sheer feeling, it's a pleasant and enjoyable feeling. But there's a difference in the way this pleasant feeling can be evaluated. And the way that feeling is evaluated depends upon the basic orientation of the mind. So if a person's mind is oriented towards sensual pleasures, and the person has the idea that to indulge in sensual pleasures is something good and worthy, then the person will not only experience the sheer pleasant quality of the pleasant feeling, but will also get a kind of intensified enjoyment, an enhanced enjoyment, which comes from the positive evaluation of the sensual pleasures. But if the person has some understanding of the drawbacks and defects of sensual pleasures, then even though they indulge in the sensual pleasures and they get some sheer feeling of pleasant feeling out of it, but also they'll be able to see the defects in those sensual pleasures. And so they will not be as entranced by the sensual pleasures. They'll not be so strongly infatuated by them. To give an example, somebody who is a lay person and becomes a stream enterer, a sotapanna, is still able to indulge in sensual desires. The person is not yet completely free of sensual craving. And so that person's experience of sensual pleasures, they'll still experience pleasure out of the sensual pleasures. But because they have a direct understanding of the Four Noble Truths, of the principle of impermanence, suffering, non-self, when they experience the sensual pleasures, they'll also be able to look back reflectively on those sensual pleasures and understand the drawbacks of those sensual pleasures. And so their mind will not be so infatuated with the sensual pleasures, will not be as addicted to the sensual pleasure as a person who is convinced that the aim of our life on earth is to enjoy sensual pleasures as much as possible. Okay, so
about the three levels of pleasure and bliss, I understood that it's three levels. One potential pleasure, and then the heavenly pleasure, and the last one is nirvana. Right?
actually there could be 4 levels here, because what's called the heavenly, I put in relationship the human sensual pleasures, the heavenly sensual pleasures. Then corresponding to that is a relationship between all sensual pleasures. And then the pleasure or happiness of samadhi and of nibbana. And so you could take the happiness of samadhi and the happiness of nibbana separately.
That was the question, because of, I thought putting samadhi and nibbana pleasure together is kind of troublesome, because samadhi is still in so sanya area, but nibbana you have to have a deep, you have to go beyond.
Yeah, there's a distinction between the happiness of samadhi and the happiness of nibbana. But because in the sutta the Buddha speaks only about a delight apart from sensual pleasures, apart from unwholesome states, which which surpasses even divine bliss. Okay, so this delight apart from sensual pleasures can refer either to the happiness of samadhi or the happiness of nibbana. The sutta itself doesn't make that explicit. But definitely other suttas will differentiate between the happiness of samadhi and the happiness of nibbana. Oh, okay.
Does craving exist in the form and form as well?
Definitely so. In fact, we're going to come to that in one of the passages that I'm intend to take today. Any further questions? Okay.
I have a question about when the sensual pleasures start to appear painful. You mentioned the experience of samadhi. I know people who say they've had experienced shining states,
Yeah.
and yet they still experience sensual pleasures as painful. They're still pleasant. Is it only in the state of nirvana that become the skin disease that become very unpleasant, very painful? Or when does it start becoming sensual pleasure painful?
It would seem to me that the sensual pleasures would be considered painful even before the attainment of the jhanas.
Well, I guess I can see the painfulness of it, the consequences of indulging.
Yeah.
But at the same time, as you said before, experience essential. I say I experience essential pleasure. I experience it pleasant still, even though I see the pitfall of too much indulgence.
Yeah.
And does that ever become like here? The analogy with the man with skin disease, when once he's cured and he's rubbed towards the fire pit, he struggles to get away because he knows it's going to be extremely painful. There's nothing pleasant about it.
Yeah.
So when does that happen with sensual pleasures?
Perhaps, I'm speculating here, perhaps it comes in making the of the four levels of liberation or enlightenment. Perhaps it comes in making the transition from the second stage to the third stage. Because one, even at the second stage, the stage of once returner, has still not eliminated sensual craving. But one at the third level has eliminated sensual craving. So I think in order to make that transition, one first has to have a very clear perception of sensual pleasures as being painful, like a burning pit. Yeah.
As a show here, I realized is talking about this stimulating CPU first called getting unstuck. And she's talking about skin disease
Yeah.
And the person suffering is a child. And then she talks about this child, the doctor gives medicine, but the doctor also says, you have to stop scratching it or it won't get better.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of fits into the question, that there is effort involved in the letting go. That it's not always pleasurable to just stop giving in to pleasure.
Yeah, definitely so. When one avoids the scratching, then there comes a period of intense irritation, annoyance. But that is precisely the purpose of the meditation, is to give some kind of pleasure outside the range of sensuality, some kind of pleasure that one can resort to and then eventually strengthen. And then when one gets the strength and pleasure of meditation, then one can drop the pleasure of the senses, the pleasures of the senses. Okay, I think we should go on now. Okay, the sections that we have continuing here are all intended to highlight the different aspects of the adinava, the dejection, the danger, the drawbacks in worldly life, mundane existence, as a way of preparing, clearing the path for the Buddha to show, to expound his world-transcending teaching, the supramundane teaching. And so the next passage, this is section number 5, is intended to show, we call it the shortcomings or drawbacks in attachment to life itself. Now we're going beyond simply attachment to sensual pleasures, but attachment to one's own individual life. And this is done, one way this is done is by pointing out the transience, the brevity of human life. And in the particular sutta that I've taken here, this is presented in the form of a legend. It's almost like a Jataka story, the Buddha relating something that took place in one of his past lives. And the Buddha speaks about a religious teacher who lived a long, long time ago, a long time before himself, named Araka. And it turns out that the Buddha will say that he himself was Araka in this previous life. And this teacher named Araka was free of sensual lust, which doesn't mean that he was an arahant or even a non-returner, but it means that he was one who was a master of the jhanas. And he had many hundreds of disciples, and so he would teach them, give them teachings on the shortness of human life. And the inevitability of death. And when one reflects deeply on how death is inevitable, how life, even what to us seems to be a long life, is in cosmic terms short, and how life is full of tribulation, then this will bring a certain detachment from the craving for life itself. And so as is usual in the Buddha's way of teaching, this is done through a number of similes, that life is just like the drops of dew on the blades on the grass in the morning. When the sun rises, the dewdrops quickly evaporate. And so in the same way, life is short, brief, and limited. Again, it's like bubbles, water bubbles that form on the surface of the water. They rise up and they burst. Or it's like a stick drawn on water. If one takes a stick and rubs it over the surface of the water, it will make a streak which quickly disappears. And so the sutta uses a number of similes in this way. And then the Buddha goes on to calculate, in order to demonstrate the shortness of human life, he speaks about one who lives for a full 100 years, which to us seems like a long lifespan. But when one lives for 100 years, it means that in Indian terms, one has 300 seasons. We get an advantage, we get 25% more, since we have 4 seasons. So if we live to be 100 years, that means we only get 100 springs, 100 winters, 100 springs, 100 summers, 100 falls. Then you calculate the number of months, how many months you have to live. Then you calculate how many days one has to live. If one is living 100 years, one gets only 36,000 days. When you actually take the figure, it doesn't seem like very much. Then one calculates the number of meals that one will eat in 36,000 days. Okay, so then the Buddha says that I have reckoned the life of one who lives 100 years, the limit of his lifespan, the number of seasons, years, months, and months, fortnights, days and nights, and the number of meals that he'll take. So now the Buddha is addressing the monks. He says, what should be done by a compassionate teacher who seeks the welfare of his disciples that I have done for you? Here are the roots of trees, here are empty huts. Meditate, do not be negligent, or else you will regret it later. That is our instruction to you. Okay, so this is one way to impress on one's mind the shortness of the lifespan. Another way to get a clear impression of how life is short and fleeting is to consider that death can come at any time, and we have no idea precisely when death will occur. For example, sometimes one sees along the roadway a terrible auto accident and people have died. But the mind always has a built-in protective mechanism which makes one think, that is something that can happen to other people, but it will never happen to me. We always think I'm destined to live my full ordinary lifespan. But if one reflects, one will see that there's no reason why a premature death should come to other people but should not come to ourselves. One might read in the newspaper, hear in the news about how a person is walking down the street and somebody came out of the alley, held him up, and then shot him. You think, that person was really unlucky, but that unluck was sort of built into him from the time of his birth. But something like that will never happen to me. But in fact, we never know when death is going to take place. And if one reflects in this way, then one could see that death can take place at any moment. Even you're driving home after this. I don't want to frighten you, but you're driving home after this class, and that's the occasion. Sometimes it happens.
I prefer to finish the whole course.
I'd like to be able to give you a guarantee that you can finish the course. Okay, we move on to the next passage. This is from a sutta which gives a good account of why in the Buddha's time there were young people even from affluent families who would leave the household life in order to adopt the homeless life of a monk. And this is the story of a monk named Ratapala, who the Buddha called the foremost of those who have gone forth into homelessness out of faith. And one time when the Buddha came to the hometown of this young man, Ratapala, the Buddha preached a sermon, and Ratapala was sitting in the audience listening, and he thought to himself that in order to lead the spiritual life to its completeness, it's difficult to do while living the life of a householder. He thought, I want to go forth into the homeless life as a disciple of the Buddha, as an ordained disciple. And so he came to the Buddha and requested ordination as a monk. But the Buddha saw that this was a young man, and so the Buddha said, I don't give ordination to anybody unless he has the permission of his parents. This was a regulation that the Buddha made after he had ordained his own son named Rahula. When the Buddha did this, then the Buddha's father was very upset, very sad, because now he had lost his own son, became the Buddha, and so he was investing all of his hopes on his grandson, Rahula, and now the Buddha had Rahula ordained as a monk. And so now there were no heirs left in the direct lineage to carry on the family. And so the Buddha's father made a request of the Buddha that for anybody to take ordination, they would have to receive the permission of their parents. And so the Buddha told this to Ratapala. He said, I won't give you ordination unless you have the permission of your parents. And so Ratapala went back home, and he told his parents that he wanted to be ordained as a follower of the Buddha. And his parents told him, they said, Ratapala, you are our only son. We love you so strongly, and we could never be parted from you. And if you were to ordain, then you have to go wandering from place to place. We'll never get to see you. In those days, travel was difficult. No postal system, no emails. And so they thought their town, Tulakotita, must have been somewhere out of the way. So they thought that they'd never get to see Rahula again. They'd never get to see Ratapala again. And so they said, please give up this idea of ordination. But Ratapala was insistent. He said, no, I want to ordain. This is the most precious opportunity that I've ever encountered. But his parents said, no, we don't give you permission. He pleaded again and again. The parents called the friends of Ratapala. They told his friends, please tell him to give up this foolish idea of ordaining. The friends tried to persuade him. No success. But the parents continued to refuse to give Ratapala permission. So finally Ratapala just sat down on the floor and said to his parents, if you don't give me permission, I'm not going to eat any more food. And so he continued like this, maintaining this hunger strike, one day after another day after another day. Each day his parents would plead with him, please eat. You can enjoy yourself, you can do good meritorious deeds, but there's no reason to get carried away by this foolish idea of becoming ordained as a Buddhist monk. But Ratapala continued with this hunger strike to the point where he was starting to turn thin. And finally his parents relented and said, okay, we give you permission, but please, after your ordination, come back and visit us. And Ratapala agreed to this. And so then he went and found the Buddha, and took ordination as a monk. Okay, then sometime after his ordination, he achieved arhatship. Then he came to the Buddha and told the Buddha that he wanted to go back to visit his parents. And so the Buddha gave him permission to go. Ratapala went and visited his parents. Then after his visit with his parents, he went to this park called the Megachara Park. And then the king came. He heard that Ratapala had returned to the town, and so he wanted to go and meet Ratapala and have a discussion with him. So that is where the sutta begins here, the passage begins here. We're on page 208. Okay, so the king approaches Ratapala, and after they exchange pleasantries, in paragraph 29, he speaks about 4 kinds of loss, because of which some people go forth from the household life into homelessness. Okay, the 4 kinds of loss are the loss of youth through aging, the loss of one's health through sickness, the loss of wealth, and the loss of relatives. Okay, but the king observes that Ratapala has suffered none of these losses, and so he asks him, what is the reason that you have gone forth into homelessness? You have not suffered any of these losses. You went forth as a young man in the prime of health, coming from a wealthy family and with many friends and relatives. So why did you go forth into the homeless life? Okay, now I'm on page 210, paragraph 35. Here Ratapala says that there are 4 summaries of the Dhamma that have been taught by the Buddha. Knowing and seeing and hearing these, I went forth from the household life into homelessness. Now what's interesting is that there's no sutta that's come down in the Sutta Pitaka in which the Buddha is actually teaching these 4 summaries of the Dhamma. And yet Ratapala is citing these as if these were 4 standard teaching, as this was a standard teaching given by the Buddha. But this little framework of 4 summaries actually brings together a number of important themes in the Buddha's teaching. And here Ratapala is presenting them as reasons for going forth into the homeless life. Okay, the first of these is that the world is unstable. It is swept away. First, I'll just present them the way they are here, and then Ratapala will then give explanations of them. Okay, the second is that the world has no shelter and no protector. The third is that the world has nothing of its own, but one has to leave everything behind and pass on. And the fourth is that the world is incomplete, insatiable, the slave of craving. Okay, so after Ratapala states these in a very concise form, then the king asks him to explain these at length. He takes each one individually. First he takes the statement, the world is unstable. It is swept away. How should the meaning of this be understood? And rather than give any kind of abstract explanation, Ratapala, just like the Buddha himself might do, takes a very concrete and personal example, relating this to the king himself. He asked the king, when you were 20, 25 years old, were you expert, skilled in all of the different skills that were expected of a king, like dealing with elephants, with horses, with chariots. And of course the king says, I was, just as if I had supernormal strength. And now Ratapala asks, now are you strong and sturdy and capable in battle? And then the king says, no, now I am old, aged, burdened with years, advanced in life, and so on. My years have turned 80. He's 80 years old. And he says, sometimes I mean to put my foot here in one place, and I put my foot somewhere else. This is something I've experienced. But I know people who are 85, 90, 100 years old who still can walk very vigorously. My own ordination teacher at the age of 101 didn't even use a walking stick to walk. Okay, so this is what, at least one implication of the idea that the world is unstable, swept away. It's swept away by old age. That we have strength and vigor in our youth, but as years go by, the strength and vigor gradually, sometimes suddenly, slips away, and then we become weak, feeble, helpless. Okay, then the king, again based on his own experience, he's saying, I'm in paragraph 39, here in this court I have elephant troops, cavalry, chariots, infantry, and with these I can subdue any threat to us. So how can we understand the statement that life in any world has no shelter and no protector? Maybe in U.S. terms we could say we have, I don't know, the stealth missile? Is that a missile or a plane? Patriot missiles, F-15 fighters, thousands and thousands of, hundreds and thousands of well-trained troops. So how can we say that we have no shelter and no protector? Okay, again, Ratapala uses a very concrete, personal example. He says, do you have any chronic ailment? And the king says, I have a chronic wind ailment. And so sometimes my friends and companions, relatives stand around me and they think, now the king is going to die, now the king is going to die. And then can you command your friends and companions, your relatives, and so on? Can you ask them, please take over part of my illness so that I don't have to suffer from this illness? Or do you have to bear that illness, that pain, all by yourself? And the king says, I cannot command this of my friends and relatives, but I have to bear that illness all by myself. This I know very much from personal experience, since I have this chronic headache condition, and when that comes on very strongly, sometimes I might have some obligation to fulfill, and I'm completely helpless, cannot do anything to fulfill it. And nobody can take that pain away, even though some people say, we would like to take the pain on ourselves, but I can't transfer it to anybody. Okay, so this is what is meant by the world. The life in any world has no shelter and no protector. Okay, the third is that this world has nothing of its own. One has to leave all and pass on. In Pali, this is sabbang bahaya gamaniyang. One has to leave everything behind. When death comes, one has to leave everything behind and pass on to one's next existence. Okay, so now to explain this, Ratapala takes the example of the king being endowed with these 5 types of sensual pleasures. He has all of this wealth at his command so that he can enjoy anything that he wants. Okay, but when death comes, then he has to pass on according to his karma, and he cannot take any of his wealth, any of his possessions with him. So this is the sense of having to leave everything behind. So one can take a person nowadays who might be a millionaire, billionaire, but when death comes, they cannot use their wealth to bribe the king of death and say, just give me 5 more years, 10 more years. But let me be sure that if I make a suitable investment in this life, that next life I come back to the same bank and then I can just check in and get my account back again. But one has to pass on and leave everything behind. And as we know from an earlier sutta, sometimes it's the unloved heirs that get one's wealth. Okay, then the 4th statement in the summary of the teaching is that of the statement, life in any world is incomplete, insatiable, the slave of craving. Okay, here Ratapala uses an example relevant to the king. Okay, you are now the king who's ruling over this kingdom, this is called the Kuru country. This is in northern India. Okay, suppose somebody came to you from the east and said that there is this country in the east, very rich, populous, plenty of troops there, plenty of wealth, plenty of women for wives, and you can easily conquer it. Go ahead and conquer it. So, what are you going to do? Is there any king of a country who will say, I'm satisfied with the territory that I have, the wealth that I have? Or will he go ahead and try to conquer that territory? So this king, being quite a normal king, not trying to pretend to be saintlier than he is, says, of course I would conquer that territory and then annex it to my own. So the same thing happens with the west, the north, the south, even lands across the sea. Whatever territory is available, the king, just through his nature, through the nature of craving, would want to conquer that territory and take possession of it. And so Ratapala says this is what the Buddha meant when he says that life in any world is incomplete, insatiable, the slave of craving. Okay, so on the basis of these 4 statements, Ratapala apparently had reflected on these ideas even before he met the Buddha. And so when he heard the Buddha's teaching, then it immediately resonated with him. And so he made this decision to go forth from the household life into homelessness. Okay, now we come to another big area in which there is this adinava, this danger or unsatisfactoriness. I'm going to say that what we've covered so far has all been relating to the danger in craving and attachment, whether it's attachment to sensual pleasures, attachment to wealth, attachment to power and position. But the other big area in which the Buddha exposes the danger is the danger in views, particularly speculative views and wrong views. And we open this with a statement of the Buddha in which he says, "I do not see even one other thing on account of which unarisen, unwholesome qualities of mind arise, and arisen, unwholesome qualities of mind increase so much as on account of wrong view. Because for one of wrong view, unarisen, unwholesome mental qualities arise, and arisen, unwholesome mental qualities increase and expand." And then the converse of this is the case that for one of wrong view, unarisen, wholesome qualities do not arise, and arisen, wholesome qualities of mind diminish. And then the third statement, "I do not see even one other thing on account of which, with the breakup of the body after death, beings are reborn in a state of misery and a bad destination in the lower world and hell, so much as on account of wrong view." And then the fourth statement says that for a person of wrong view, whatever bodily, verbal, or mental conduct he undertakes in accordance with that view, and whatever volition, aspiration, wish, and volitional formations he engenders in accordance with that view, all lead to what is undesirable, unwanted, and disagreeable, to harm and suffering. And this, he compares this to the case of a seed of, do you know what neem is? It's a kind of tree that grows in India, Sri Lanka, which is extremely bitter. It's like a seed of bitter cucumber or bitter gourd. When that seed starts to grow, it picks up the nutriment from the soil, it picks up the water, and then it converts it into the fruit, but the fruit or the tree is always bitter. Everything in the tree is bitter, and the plant is bitter, and the fruit is bitter. And so it's like this, the Buddha says, in the case of wrong view. Whatever action one undertakes based on that view, whatever wishes, whatever aspirations one forms in accordance with that view, will lead to harm and suffering. Okay, now what is meant here by wrong view? It's something quite specific in the early Buddhist teaching. Okay, the Pali is Miccha Ditthi, and when this is explained in the suttas, it's almost always explained as the type of view which is seen to be detrimental to the observance of ethics. And specifically, it's the view which denies that there is any benefit from doing any kind of actions that we would consider good or meritorious. It's the view that there's no point in practicing giving, generosity, self-sacrifice, no point in looking after one's mother and father, no point in having respect for ascetics and Brahmins. The view that there's no result and fruit of good and bad actions. And the view that there are no religious practitioners, or it's called ascetics, samana brahmana, in this world who are practicing rightly, living a righteous and wholesome life. Okay, what strikes me that in our own time, there are many people hold the views that there's no life after death, no fruit of good and bad actions. But these people, in the contemporary times, do not seem to fit the mold of those that the Buddha is condemning as being of miccha ditthi. Because, you see, in the Buddha's time, it was taken to be standard, the standard prevailing view of a respectable person in society, that there is some result and fruit of good and bad actions, that life in this world is governed by a moral law, such that one progresses as a result of one's good actions, and one deteriorates through unwholesome actions or bad actions. And for a person to reject this particular belief structure was seen as detrimental to the maintenance of standards of righteous conduct. One would expect in the Buddha's time that those who advocated this view would then go on to advocate that it doesn't matter what one does, one could kill, murder, slay others, rob others, without having to face any bad consequences. In fact, some of the Buddha's contemporaries said that the person who advocates generosity, giving, is a foolish person. Since the body or life consists only of the body, which consists only of the material elements, when death takes place, the elements fall apart, and there's nothing that continues beyond death. So one might as well do whatever one wants in this very life and doesn't have to give any consideration to the long-term consequences of one's actions. Okay, so from the perspective of the Buddha, if one adopts a view like this, then this will serve as a kind of theoretical justification for behaving in any way one wants, for not following any kind of ethical guidelines. But to myself it seems rather doubtful that we could apply this exactly, literally, in all respects to the contemporary world, where there are many people who don't believe in any continuation of life beyond death, but still hold to the need to observe ethical standards of conduct. In fact, we don't even have to speak about the contemporary world, but even in ancient China, Confucius, for example, had no very clear conception of an afterlife and no concern with what happens in the life beyond death. And yet Confucius insisted on the observance of principles of right conduct, making ren, benevolence, human-heartedness the foundation of one's life, and observing the rules of right conduct. Judaism also is very, at least the most ancient form of Judaism, is very unclear about any survival, any individual survival beyond death. And yet Judaism is generally insisted on quite high standards of conduct, ethical conduct. Does anybody have any ideas about this? Yes.
I'm just wondering if wrong view really equates to the contemporary term of nihilism.
To the contemporary term nihilism. Sometimes the particular type of wrong view which the Buddha singles out most often is called Nattikavada, and it's translated as nihilism. Often it's translated nihilism. But I don't know, is there a precise definition of nihilism, contemporary nihilism?
I'm sure there is, I just don't have it.
I don't know that there is a single precise definition of nihilism. And maybe contemporary nihilism is not seen so much as partly a view, but I think partly it's the attitude that one could behave in any way that one wants, do anything that one is impelled to do, without having to give any attention to the consequences. If one explains nihilism in that way, then it would seem that what's called Nattikavada is very much like contemporary nihilism. Yes, you will.
I actually thought about this for a long time. I think I've had this discussion many years ago. And I come to a conclusion for myself at this point that Buddhism is superior to other forms of thinking, contemporary thinking, that doesn't, the thinking that doesn't resort to like karma, belief in karma, but still uphold moral standard. But still, I think Buddhism is superior because these other forms of beliefs don't offer a progressive program that is stable and also secure. If I follow Buddhism, I know if I follow the teachings correctly, eventually I will reach to the foremost of all those on acting, which is Nirvana, the perfection of humanity. And if I follow a contemporary modern system of thinking, I may have integrity in this world. I don't know what I will do when I'm faced with a decision, a tough decision, when I am truly faced with a very difficult, and that difficulty may vary between different people. For me, I constantly thought about what would I do in this situation, that situation. And I don't know if I just use my current humanity training, I will be able to hold up to that standard. And that to me is very scary. And therefore, I want to take refuge in the truth again.
Yeah. Yes.
Just in amendment to your comment on what I heard in that, is that not also a form of passion?
You mean adopting the Buddhist view?
Adopting Buddhism to get somewhere. I want to answer that. Because this actually connects back to the question I was going to ask earlier about craving.
About
craving.
Yeah.
Because I gradually realized that craving is the driving force, the impetus behind any kind of grasping. And in order to get somewhere, we need to have this driving force of grasping. I was going to ask you that in order to...
The driving force of
grasping.
Grasping, okay.
The existence.
Yeah.
The dharma, the phenomena. Anything that exists needs to have a driving force. And I think I gradually believe that driving force has to be some kind of craving. So at different levels, say at central level, we have central craving. But I feel about that craving, satisfaction of that craving.
Right.
For a higher level of craving, say forms around craving.
Yeah.
But once I have that, I realize that has danger.
Yeah.
Therefore, I go to the next level.
Yeah.
Forms from. And then I realize that also is craving that anywhere. Therefore, I want to nirvana. But my question now is that But therefore, I'm okay grasping Buddhism.
Yeah.
I find Buddhism, I take Buddha dogma. I don't want to take Buddhism as a form of religion. I want to follow Buddha's teaching.
Yeah.
When I get to the level of Nirvana, I was worried about it.
Yeah. Okay, let us say, coming back to her question, that there is a desire for Nibbana, and the Buddha encourages that kind of desire. But now you see, the way the text used words is one has to pay close attention to the way the text used words. And when the text uses the word craving, almost always craving is specified as the desire for something which is unwholesome, the desire for something which is based upon the idea of self, getting something for self. Okay, now there's a motivation for nirvana, and that is also called desire. The word used is chanda. And so, in order to gain this ultimate goal, one needs the desire to attain it. Without the desire to attain it, then there's no effort. Without the effort, there's no attainment. But one uses this desire in order to develop those qualities which will bring the abandoning of all desire, all craving. And so one uses desire in order to end desire. And it's not as paradoxical as it seems. In fact, there's a sutta, a discourse where a Brahmin comes to Ananda. Ananda is staying in a park. A Brahmin comes to see him and asks about the 4 bases of spiritual success. And one of them, the first of these, is desire. So then the Brahmin brings up an objection. Can you use desire to end desire? And then Ananda sort of turns the question on its head by asking the Brahmin, before you came here, didn't you have a desire to come to the park? And the Brahmin says, yes. Then Ananda says, now that you've reached the park, do you still have that desire to come to the park? And the Brahmin says, I no longer have that desire, because by arriving at the park, the desire has been fulfilled.
But then you want to go somewhere else.
The problem with analogies is that one can't push them you can't take them too literally and try to always adhere exactly to their implications.
Along the same lines, Buddhism itself has been accused of nihilism. That the goal has been presented as extinction or nothingness, or some kind of nihil means nothing.
Yeah, that is taking nihilism maybe in a different sense, not in a moral sense.
Right, but it's like what the lady was saying, like, what is the motivation? Like in other religions, we have this paradise, and it's wonderful, with women in Islam, or with angels, whatever.
Sure.
But in Buddhism, that goes into more like...
It's not as concrete.
It's not like, pastor, how you motivate people to strong.
I think maybe to go into that question would take me a little bit too far away from the topic of the discussion today. So let me just ask first whether there's any questions which really pertain quite closely and directly to what I've been explaining so far. If not, then we'll go further. Okay, no questions? Okay, then we will continue. Okay, so the danger in wrong view, particularly this view nothing about it, a view that we might call nihilism, is that if one adopts a view like this, it will form the theoretical background to unwholesome behavior. It will give one the idea that it doesn't matter how one behaves, that one could just act according to one's impulses, and generally these will be impulses connected with greed, hatred, and delusion. And so this will bring about the arising of unwholesome states of mind, and those unwholesome states of mind will bring undesirable results in the future, even rebirth into lower realms. Okay, another danger that the Buddha points out in relation to views is that they lead to quarrels, conflicts, and disputes. That when one grasps hold of a particular view, then one, along with adoption of that view, one gives rise to the notion that my view is the correct view. My opinion is the superior opinion. Other views are wrong, biased, inadequate, and then one will bolster one's sense of one's own importance, one's own value because of one's view, and one will engage in disputes with others who hold different views. The Buddha illustrates this, one of the most famous similes from Buddhist texts. It's the simile of the blind men and the elephants. He takes the example of one time there was a king in Savatthi who had a number of blind men rounded up in the city, and then he presented them with an elephant. And he asked them, what is the elephant like? And he would present different parts of the elephant to different blind men. And so one who has felt the head of the elephant would say the elephant is like a water jar. And one who has shown the ear would say the elephant is like a winnowing basket. Another who had felt the tusk of the elephant said the elephant is like a plowshare. One who had felt the trunk said that the elephant is like a plow pole, and so on. And so these men, the blind men, each one would think that his view or his understanding of the elephant is correct, and he would say the elephant is like this. The other blind men would say the elephant is not like that, but the elephant is like this. And so they fight with each other, and quarrel and fight, while the king is amused by this. And so the Buddha says, the wanderers of other sects who hold to these views are blind and sightless, and thus they become quarrelsome, disputatious, and wrangling, wounding each other with verbal darts. So this is another drawback in views, is that views lead to a kind of self-exaltation and a clinging or grasping to one's own point of view, and then a disparagement and fierce rejection of other points of view. Does anybody have an idea of a particular irony in this example that the Buddha uses here? Excuse me? I can't quite hear. Use the I wasn't thinking of it from that angle.
I think it's talking about us. We are raising our view when we claim we are right, we are wrong. It's more about when we claim we are right, we are wrong. It's more about us, not the Buddha.
wasn't quite what I had in mind. But in the sutta, the Buddha is speaking about wanderers of other sects. Anybody know about the history of the Buddhist tradition? How many schools of Buddhism do we have? How many?
8.
Well, this is a sort of legendary figure as 18 schools this is pre-Mahayana schools in India. Maybe some of the divisions of these schools are not so significant, but let's say there are at least 4 or 5 major camps of Buddhism before the rise of Mahayana. Each one would have their own particular systematization of the Buddha's teaching. One has the Pugalavadins, who hold that there's some kind of person outside the 5 aggregates. You have the Sarvastivadins with their Abhidharma system. Dharmaguptakas, or the Vajravadins with their particular views. Mahasangikas with their particular views. Those are the main camps. And each one, within each camp, a treatise is composed refuting the views of the followers of other systems. Okay, then sometime around 1st century BC, the Mahayana starts to rise. Then one has maybe 1st century, 2nd century, the Madhyamaka system, criticizing the views of all of the other earlier schools. Then, a century or 2 later, the Jnanavada system, criticizing the Madhyamakas. And then, even within the Madhyamaka camp, divisions come between the Swatantrika and Prasangika Madhyamaka. Each one criticizes the other that they haven't properly understood Nagarjuna. Within the Yogacara, Vijnanavada camp, again differences emerge. And so one has at least 20 different schools of Indian Buddhism criticizing each other. And sometimes if you read the philosophical treatises of the schools, you see that the languages become quite bitter, sometimes quite acrimonious. And even in contemporary times, we have the Theravada school. You might think, Theravada, at least it might be unified. But I remember when I was in Sri Lanka, there was a big quarrel going on between those who believe that jhana is necessary before you develop vipassana, and those who say that one could develop vipassana without developing jhana. Then in a Buddhist magazine published in Sri Lanka at that time called World Buddhism, there was a debate between a learned Burmese monk arguing in favor of the straight vipassana approach, and the Sri Lankan monk arguing that jhana is necessary before you can practice vipassana. And the language that was used in I think it was a monthly magazine. So each month, one of the 2 contenders would have the chance to argue his point of view. And the language that was used when one would refer to the other would be quite sarcastic, cutting, sardonic, caustic, putting the other down, sometimes using a kind of polite irony, as my learned friend in Burma says, without properly understanding the meaning of the Buddha in that sutta. And so one gets these quarrels within Buddhism as well. So it seems that whether one holds views or not is not so much a matter of what particular teaching or doctrine one is subscribing to, but a matter of one's attitude towards the view one is adopting. Okay, any questions?
Yes, I will come to understand that all views are And that kind of differs from the notion of right view, wrong view. And
Yeah.
I wonder if this is maybe that the right view, wrong view is conventional, and the all views are dangerous is more moving towards the ultimate. Or what's the difference, and where in Buddhist thought did the idea of all views are dangerous, even Buddhist views?
I don't think Buddhist texts will say that all views are dangerous. But what is said is that the Buddha does distinguish between right views and wrong views. But what the Buddha teaches is that one uses right views as part of the path. One doesn't hold to views and take them to be absolute in themselves. But the purpose of a view, we say that the view has a pragmatic purpose. Its purpose is to lead to the abandoning of clinging. And so the Buddha compares his teaching, the Dharma, to a raft that takes one across the stream, and says that one uses the raft, one doesn't get across the stream without the raft. But if one uses the raft, if one understands the raft properly, one understands it's an instrument or a means for crossing the stream. It's not something that one puts on one's head and carries around and says, see how beautiful my raft is better than your raft. But it's also true, I think, that according to the Buddha, that there are certain views which correspond to the nature of reality, the way things are. And so one uses these views in order to see and understand things the way they really are. Whereas other views are contrary to the way things really are. But it's also possible that one could cling to views that correspond to the nature of reality, in which case one is not using the view correctly and properly. Majjhima Nikaya number 38, the Buddha says, he's speaking about dependent origination, he says, even this view of dependent origination, which is clear, pure, liberating, if you cling to this view and treasure it and fondle it, you will not, it shows that you do not understand my purpose in teaching views, which is to use the view just the way one uses the raft to cross the stream. Okay, I think we'll have to stop at this point, and next week we'll continue from where we left off, still in the domain of views, then finishing up this chapter, and probably coming into the beginning of the next chapter, where we enter onto the path to liberation. But it's not next week. I won't be here, so this is 2 weeks from this Saturday. Today is the 12th?
Yes.
19th, 26th. The next class will be on the 26th. Okay, let us end by sharing the merits. Okay, we share the merits with the Devas, the Dharma-protecting deities, the Nagas, the Bhutas, the fair spirits, asking them to rejoice in these merits, to protect the Dharma, to protect the world, to protect ourselves and others. Akasata chabumata deva naga mahitika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu sasanam. Akasata chabumata deva naga mahitika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu desanam. Akasata chabumata deva naga mahitika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu mang parang. Etavatacha amhehi sampadang punya sampadang sabbe devanumodantu sabba sampati siddhya Etavatacham hehi sampadang punya sampadang sabbe bhutanumodantu sabba sampati siddhya. Etavatacham hehi sampadang punya sampadang sabbe satanumodantu sabba sampati siddhya. Bhavagupadaya avici hetato etantare satakai upapanna rupi arupi cha asanya sanyino tukha pamuchantu pusantu nibutim.